So welcome to the LSE Government Department event today on how to be a Liberal. I am Simon Hicks. I'm the Harold Laski Professor of Political Science at the LSE and also Pro-Director for Research. That's a fancy name for saying Vice President. It is a real great pleasure and honour for me to welcome Ian Dunt today to talk about his wonderful book, How to be a Liberal. So those of you who've tuned in for me to grill him, I think we'll find it's going to be hard for me to grill him because I'm too much of a fan of the book, but we'll see what we can do. Let me first introduce Ian. Ian is editor of politics.co.uk. He specialises in a whole range of issues, but has written a lot on immigration, civil liberties, social justice, and appeared as a pundit on BBC, Sky News, Al Jazeera, and many other places. He's a regular contributor to two podcasts, Romaniats, or it's now called Oh God, What Now? And The Bunker. His first book, Brexit, What the Hell Happens Now, 2016, revealed the impact of Britain leaving the EU in unflinching detail. Today, he's with us to discuss his latest book, which tells the story of liberalism from its birth in the fight against absolute monarchy to the modern-day resistance against the new populism. For Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE How to Be a Liberal, all one word. This online event is being recorded and will be put online as a podcast, assuming we have no technical difficulties as we go along. As usual, there'll be a chance for you to put your questions to Ian. Please use the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. We're going to have a little discussion amongst ourselves, then we'll open it up to the audience. If you want to put a question in the Q&A, please say who you are so I can call your name out as I answer the questions. So I'm going to hand over to Ian first to introduce what did you hope to achieve with the book, Ian, and why did you write it now? Why now? And what do you think you've contributed to us?
Yeah, who knows? Who knows what world events would have suddenly made me think that liberalism is something we should be discussing at the moment? And I kind of there's a John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. Harriet Taylor's his wife and his working partner, who, you know, in my view, is half of the contribution to what we now think of as John Stuart Mill for certain keywords. And they have this thing with free speech where they say, really, you need both confidence and humility, right? Like when you go into an argument, you should be not searching for the smallest, most sort of neglectful elements of the argument that you can easily turn to your advantage. You should be taking the argument at full force, feeling the full force of it against you. And next to that supreme amount of confidence that they ask from people, they also want humility, which was this idea of half-truth. That there are little slivers of truth, even in your most misguided opponents. And your job is not to destroy them. Your job is to try and find these precious little scraps of truth and see what you can put together. And I was sort of thinking, like, with confidence and humility, what would be your approach looking at liberalism, looking at what liberalism is and its history? And to me, it communicated into, now more than ever, we need the confidence of our convictions. That things started going wrong for us. We started seeing, you know, the rise of Orban, of people like Donald Trump. The moment that we stopped having the courage of our convictions, the arguments could be turned against us. For instance, to say, the people versus the elite, and you're just an elitist if you start standing up for individual rights or for science or for empirical research. And that really did, I think, a number on us ideologically. It robbed us of our confidence, and we needed to refine the values that work. But the second part of it then was the humility, like what had gone wrong in liberalism. Like, how did we get to that point? And that was a story really that brought me into, I think, laissez-faire, the right-wing school of liberalism on economics, that I think we were almost completely seduced by, and that led liberalism to just give up on whole communities across the West. But also, in another way, to stop fighting for really the rights of marginalized people, to do with race, to do with gender, to do with sexuality, people who are just frozen out of society, and who liberals just didn't seem to care enough about, who they weren't inquisitive enough about their experiences to think about the kinds of freedom that were affected by discrimination and prejudice. And so thinking about it in those terms, in terms of confidence and humility, eventually basically just broke my life and led to 2 years of researching, starting with Descartes, working your way up through the scientific revolution to the French Revolution, you know, to John Stuart Mill, to fascism and communism, to Keynes versus Hayek, to the financial crash and identity politics and Donald Trump and Brexit and the rest, which was probably more than I anticipated biting off at the start of the project, and which I now slightly regret dedicating so much time to.
No, I mean, I think it's, that's a lovely summary. I mean, in a sense, what I like about the book, what I particularly like about the book is it's a sort of, it's out and proud, it's a kind of, I'm a liberal. And it's a kind of, why is liberalism's kind of become a dirty word these days? It's attacked from the right because, it's a sort of, oh, you wussy liberal, you don't understand nation and identity and nationalism, and you're this global, unrooted cosmopolitan citizen of anywhere. From the left, it's attached for being a kind of neoliberal, free, laissez-faire, free marketeer, libertarian. We've now got everybody seems, all my students seem to call themselves either socialists or libertarians. And so so I see the book as a kind of, it's an answer to both of those criticisms. Is that more or less a fair take?
Yeah, I think that is fair. We do have some kind of terrible branding problem. At some stage across the way, it became the word that people used as an insult rather than something people proudly associated with. But I think that also speaks to that first thing I mentioned of we stop fighting for our values. And one of the core ideas in liberalism is you cannot allow truths to fossilize. That the moment that happens, the moment that there isn't rigorous life, the blood isn't pumping through an idea, it just starts to disintegrate in your hands. And liberals have done this weirdly, looking back over that history, they do it very regularly. And it's basically the moment they become complacent. And they become complacent in a weird way. They never say, no one ever says, I'm complacent now, I'm just going to sit on my ass for the rest of my life. No one ever does that. What they say is, the wind of history blows in our direction. And I used to say that stuff. I remembered sitting in pubs, such complacency, in like the early 2010s even. Talking to friends just going, well, the world just becomes more liberal. We just become more free about certain social categories or whatever else. That's just the direction of history. And history has no direction. History is set by people who do not get complacent and who fight for their values and go out.
It's certainly not linear in that kind of linear progressive narrative of history. Mm-hmm. Sit by and eventually we'll all be in this liberal utopia at some end point.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
You're saying you need to fight for that. You need to actually stand up, and liberals actually, being a liberal is not just a laissez-faire, i.e. we leave things as they are. Being a liberal is radical in a sense of progressive with a capital P, meaning you actually want to change things to make things liberal. If you're not actively involved in thinking about how you change things to make the world a better place, actually that's not liberal in a sense. Is that more or less the sort of...
Yeah, well, it's to be committed to certain key values. It's to be committed to the freedom of the individual. And that does not mean what many people associate it with, which is this kind of Thatcherite right-wing economic view. It means that your assessment is not done by blobs of humanity who have virtue or who can be dismissed. It's that you care about each person and try to maximize the freedom that they have insofar as it can be without affecting the freedom of someone else. It means that you base the way that you look at the world on reason, on rationality, on evidence. And it means, quite strikingly and importantly, that your politics are, and this is not a fashionable word at the moment, but they're moderate. And that idea of moderation is quite cool. It comes up quite late actually with Isaiah Berlin, but it comes from this liberal idea of there are no happy endings. There's no point in human history that everything's going to be resolved and we all live in some kind of utopia. It's, for instance, Marxism will tell you that there is. We will always have human conflict. And therefore it's necessary to just start smoothing the edges of how we do policy, of how we use rhetoric, of how we engage with each other to minimize the inevitable tragedies of human existence. And then there's a fourth part to the liberal idea of who you are. And that's autonomy, which to me is the most important part personally in how you live your life, which is to say you live your life as you choose to do it. You can be a monk if you want, you can go into the army, it doesn't have to be a life of freedom, but you have to choose it for yourself, not because of family pressure, not because of societal pressure, not because you just want to conform, but because you yourself have been present in the moment and decided what you want for yourself. And those values, those core liberal values, are not ever going to be unhelpful at a certain point. they keep on going and keep on being the key towards human freedom. And we should use them now with some pride in the word as we do it.
That's great. So, I mean, I can see some great questions coming in on the Q&A, but there's a couple of things I wanted to push you on a little bit that you skirt around in the book. And both of them, I think, are really main challenges to liberalism that I'm not quite sure you have an answer to. One is sort of liberal nationalism, the sort of, which goes all the way from, I mean, you talk about the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. You don't talk about 1848. You don't talk about the kind of national liberal revolutions. And I suspect it's because it doesn't fit your narrative. You don't talk about so when I was an undergraduate, my specialist subject, I did politics and history, was actually the 1848 revolutions. And it's a moment of liberal nationalism. It's when all those tricolors across Europe get copied. And it's the notion of the nation is as a liberal concept. The sort of, Germany as a liberal concept, the breaking up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the sort of romantic liberalism in that period. I think there's sort of echoes of that today with the whole debate about Brexit, with Scotland, with some of the sort of take back control from international institutions. Of course, within Brexit, it's a coalition of the sort of nasty road to serfdom type nationalism, which is quite clear in your book, if you've got an answer to. But it's also that sort of liberal nationalism. If you read a lot of the free traders or the sort of libertarian nationalists, and they sort of say that, we as nations, we can think of in a liberal sense as being able to make their own free choice. So, and I think that's a real threat to a kind of multilateral version of liberalism that is right through the book. And it's a sort of line that goes from 1848 to Woodrow Wilson, self-determination of nations, through then to some of the narrative today that we see on sort of the centre-right amongst liberal, or even the Scottish National Party. So,
so let me back that around a little bit. So you're right. I mean, go back to John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill would be one of the key people that you would look to liberal nationalism. Now, nationalism in this context is not used in the same way that I use it in the book, right? So I go for a quite sort of strict definition of it that I'm using really as a kind of right-wing populism. I don't like the word populism in the books. It's a bit too posh and academic, so I try to avoid it. This kind of nationalism, and I'm going to simplify it.
It's a sort of ethno-nationalism is what you're thinking about.
But let me talk about that sort of early liberal nationalism, and I'm going to do it quite crudely. And this is quite crude to the point of not quite working, but I think I'm on the right side of the line. Pull me up on it if you still think so. And you essentially say nations exist, they matter to the people within them, and they are entitled to a degree of autonomy, to as much autonomy as you can give them. And then the liberal view to put across that is individuals exist, they matter to the individuals who compose them, and they're entitled to a certain amount of autonomy as well. And that, to me, and to the thinkers who I think have addressed this best, who in the 20th century were George Orwell, who wasn't usually considered a thinker, but did, I think, really important work here, and most importantly, Isaiah Berlin, is not a contradiction. That ultimately, insofar as nations matter, it is because the individuals within them care about them. That's where the patriotism takes hold. And liberals must care about the things that individuals care about. Now, over and over, we see individuals do care, not just about their nation, but their local place, and also about their broader sense of identity. They care about their sexuality, about their race, about their ethnic heritage. And therefore, these things must matter to liberals. But then I'd like to go to the second part of that, which is the autonomy of the individual in liberalism is not absolute, right? You don't get to just go and murder someone. You have to obviously pay attention to the freedom of others. Now, that is the same for nationalism in this Victorian context, which is that the nation has limits on the things that it can do. Now, you look at that post-war liberal period from sort of 45, arguably up until Brexit, when you see, the creation of the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that turns into the WTO. You see, obviously, the creation of what becomes the EU. You see the origination of human rights law. All of these things limit sovereignty. They limit the things that an individual nation can do. Now, obviously, the EU does that in quite a striking way by harmonizing, aligning on regulations. But even if you look at the WTO, which now is, oddly enough, the love child of Brexiters in the UK, but the hate figure of the Trumpists in the US. Now, what does that do? That limits sovereignty. If you take the most favored nation rule, say you can't discriminate in your tariff provisions, Now, once you sign up to that, you're saying that we have lost that jurisdiction on the domestic sphere unless we decide to leave the WTO. If you sign up to the Strasbourg Court, you're saying, well, we don't get to, invade people's family lives, or we don't get to enter into speech, no matter how many people vote for it at home. So as long as you're dealing with these categories, again, using nationalism in the Victorian terms, of the individual and the nation as having relative autonomy, I just don't see that there is any contradiction between those propositions. And I would even go a bit further and go that you need liberalism, you need the freedom of the individual to come up with a sound moral basis upon which that idea of the nation can operate.
So, would you be in favour of Scottish independence?
I have a slight issue. I mean, Scottish independence on liberal terms is completely legitimate, and obviously, I mean, national self-determination is completely legitimate and fits well within the liberal sphere. For me personally, I have a slightly weirder view on it, which comes from my personal background, which is not to do with anything about how they should vote. And it's to do with the fact that I come from an immigrant family, right? And for mostly immigrant families in England, we don't really think of ourselves as English. We tend to think of ourselves as British. Britain is the many things in one. It has a multicultural sense to it, imbued in the DNA of what it is. So for people like me, Scottish independence is kind of a startling proposition, because you're like, oh, well, that's actually challenging how I think of my own country.
It's funny because I'm the other way around. I'm English as they come, grew up on the south coast of England. And I always hated Britain, because Britain, to me, represented a kind of upper-class toffs view of the world. And English was football and pub and beer and the specials and madness. I mean, that was English. And British was waving the Union Jack and invading foreign countries. And I remember as a student in Florence when I was doing my PhD, me and another English student wanted to organise an English party, because there'd been a Scottish party and a Welsh party, and we were going to serve warm beer and chips and play ska music. And the French and the Scots and the Irish organised a boycott the English party because of the English nationalists. And we said, no, we're post-nationalist. We're a kind of, Britain is nationalism. England is not nationalism.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's a completely different conception.
But surely you had that. I mean, when I was growing up, and it could be, I'm not trying to push the point. I'm slightly younger than you. And by the time I was growing up, the Union Jack was kind of Britpop. You know what I mean? By then it was quite a cool image. And the St. George's Cross, if you saw that in a house, that meant something. That meant I'm not welcome in that place. Or the people that I know would not be welcome there. And so they're just very different associations in my head. This has nothing to do with the kind of stuff that we're talking about on the politics.
But the Scottish thing is interesting, though, because one of the tensions of any kind of national self-determination movement, whether it's Scottish independence or Brexit or Make America Great Again or any of these types of things, is it tends to be a coalition between the sort of intellectual, liberal, nationalist cosmopolitans and a sort of nasty red tooth and claw, ethnic nationalist, populist nationalism. And the moderate wing ends up being eaten by the more, ethnic, anti-immigrant, flag-waving nationalism. And so I think that's the tension at the heart of Brexit. I think that's the tension potentially at the heart of Scottish independence too. So,
yeah, that's true. Well, we're going to see a big test, I think, over the next few years of whether Scottish independence can be delivered in a way that is consistent with liberal values, especially on really broad categories like objective truth. I mean, you saw that report that came out yesterday on the border between Scotland and England, saying we can have a high-tech frictionless border. There'll be no need to have any concerns about it. And it was honestly like I was stuck in some kind of nightmarish Groundhog Day where we were just going to have the same debate, but everyone would swap sides and say the precise opposite of what they'd said 2 years before. So I don't know if I can survive that.
Orwell had it right.
Right. Well, I have, it's partly to do with spending so long, challenging Brexit. But I've now got quite a few friends that are in the SNP in various categories with their MPs or MEPs and they've been really honourable about this kind of stuff so far. And I do think there'll be a test for the SNP over the next few years of, can you talk about this in ways that are true? Can you not go down the Brexit pathway and just deal with regurgitated post-truth? Can you say, look, that if we're going to join the EU customs union and the EU single market, there will be friction on the border with England. Like, that is simply the case. It is objectively the case. And a good test for whether you can keep that kind of political movement from veering into these dangerous Brexit territories, I think, will come on that border dispute.
Great. All right. So let's shift territory to a second area I'm particularly interested in, which you don't really touch on in the book, which is about the environment, climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And which is about, what's the liberal view of this? Because isn't ultimately our destruction of the planet a result of freedom of the individual choices? Because, the individual can only make choices about themselves and their own lives, and they've got limited capacity to influence. And the negative externalities of those individual choices are what we're now facing in terms of global environmental destruction. So how can you reconcile liberalism with how the world can actually tackle the climate change issue or, global environmental destruction?
You see, this is the thing and this is arguably the gap between liberalism and libertarianism. Although I've got to say, I've asked every libertarian I've met, what is it? And I never really get a very clear answer apart from liberalism, but we forgot the second and third stages of the reasoning. Ultimately, it's not just the individual gets to do whatever they want. It's we maximize the freedom of the individual insofar as it is not affecting the freedom of any other individual.
So it's the harm principle as applied to climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and of course it goes way back from before. It goes all the way back to the moment that Overton sat in a jail cell during the English Civil War and spoke about individual freedom. He instantly applied the rider and the limit to it is when I interfere with someone else's freedom. So even 200 years before John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, you had that rider there. Now, when we apply that to any issue, we come up with we don't need to hear it now. I'm legally unable to leave my house unless I'm going to go for a run or to get some groceries. Now, that is an extremely significant interference in my personal freedom. And it's done, why? To ultimately maintain the freedom of other people. We call it public health. But in fact, when you're trying to save someone's life from unnecessary death, that is a maintenance of their capacity to make free choices. The same thing applies with the environment. To give an impression of that, of why that is ultimately a question of individual freedom, I was hearing a debate the other day about the ethics of terraforming Mars on a podcast. And so once someone said it, everyone else just spluttered with confusion. We said, well, what possible ethics could there be? There's no one there. So we sort of intuitively understand that it's not because the planet itself is a person, it's that we are trying to protect the freedom, in this case of a much larger category, by limiting the actions of an individual. I would also, by the way, point out...
Generational justice comes in then.
Yes, sorry, before I do that, can I just point out one thing? I would also say, by the way, you have society, if you look at China right now, China is not a society that cares about individual freedom, and it's still, exploiting the environment. So I don't think this is a problem just for liberalism. It is a problem for the species.
But the harm principle as applied to environmental damage, is almost limitless, isn't it? Because pretty much anything we do damages the environment. So it's not quite the same as, turning on the lights. Us here on a webcam.
Right.
So it's very difficult, I find, to think clearly about the application of the harm principle.
And of course that's exactly what I said in the first. As soon as the harm principle is mentioned, they say, of course, there really are no behaviors that don't affect anybody else, right? If you allow, someone, unless we're going to say we're going to ban sweets, you are going to, or fatty beef burgers, we're going to find that there are people who eat those burgers who get ill when they die, and they're going to cost resources in their health service. That's going to affect their family. It's going to affect the people around them. So ultimately, we are unable to live, thank Christ, in a way that doesn't affect any of the people around us. We're connected to each other. Our job as liberals is to think about quality and quantity of freedom. What kinds of freedoms do we value? Do we think it's more valuable to be able to do something or to not have the effect of something? How many people are affected by a decision? How long does a decision last? How many freedoms will it take away for that period? Now, in the case of climate change, it will take away freedoms from a lot of people for a very long time of a very high degree of quality. And you therefore have an authorization for quite a lot of restriction in individual activity in order to deal with this problem. But of course, liberalism isn't telling you what to think. It doesn't tell you the conclusions you're supposed to come to. What it tells you is how to think. What are the moral categories you should be using? Should you be deploying reason with it? What are the things you should be valuing as you try to come to it? So it will never come up with a set conclusion, and you could I think it would be quite a crude argument, but you could potentially, as a liberal, say it would be against individual freedom to do anything about the environment at all. But certainly I don't think there's any kind of incompatibility between dealing with collective problems in health or anything else and prioritizing the freedom of the individual. And again, just like with nationalism, I would say you need the freedom of the individual to dictate to you why you would be concerned about this thing in the first place.
We need another chapter in the book here.
No, oh my God, we don't.
All right, let's move over to some of the questions in the Q&A. We've got some great ones. I'm going to pick them out. So Meg Thomas asked the first one. Why is liberalism often viewed as the centre between left and right? Is it far more radical than this in reality? And can it really be considered as part of the left-right spectrum?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think the answer to that is that liberalism doesn't have a set view on economics. It has two wings. I mean, it has many more wings than that, but on economics, it really has two key wings. And they emerge right at the start, like right in the English Civil War, you see them, and then they filter up through, for instance, Frederick Hayek and John Maynard Keynes. And one of them is really the right wing, the laissez-faire view is you get to keep all your stuff. When we talk about individual freedom, we mean your right to get stuff and to not have anyone take it away from you. It then has a secondary argument, which is that by having that sphere of freedom on your stuff, you create supply and demand. That leads to an increase in production and everyone is materially better off. So there's a collective benefit as well. The left-wing view or the egalitarian liberal view or the radical liberal view, which weirdly, insanely almost, originates really with John Stuart Mill, although there's traces of it in Adam Smith and in John Locke, and then finds its sort of real fleshed out pronouncement with Keynes, is instead that actually we need to interfere with the market. We need to interfere with people's stuff to take money off them through taxation in order to increase the opportunity for everyone. Now, what's funny to me about the way that this is seen now, and most of the debates that I'll have on radio or whatever will be with people who consider themselves much further to the left than I am, with socialists on the left of the Labour Party or something, is that actually most of the achievements that were done in this country and most of the West that we consider left-wing were the result of liberalism, of radical liberalism. Whether it comes from the NHS, whether it comes from the welfare system, whether it comes to the regulation of companies to make sure that they cannot destabilize the economy or they cannot pollute the planet. These are all left-wing liberal views. But I think something about
from the people's budget in 1909 through to Beveridge, through to...
Exactly. And it's extraordinary to me to see them sort of wielded as weapons against liberalism. When you think, well, what exactly have you looked at this weapon that you're trying to wield? I do think the confusion fundamentally does come that and this has to be granted. If someone says, I am a liberal, you cannot from that word alone presume what their economic opinions are. And people who are laissez-faire liberals, who I obviously spent a lot of that book criticizing what they did to us, are still liberals. They are liberals and they're entitled to be called liberal. This is an internal dispute within liberalism. So for that reason, maybe it makes it murky. But again, and I would say this, I think that's kind of gives you an indication of one of the vitality of the health of the sort of intellectual vibrancy of liberalism rather than being any kind of defect.
Very good. Okay, so Joanna Bryson, that's the next one. Isn't loss of confidence and ground for liberalism concomitant with the increase of polarisation and inequality? Didn't inequality in the UK massively increase during the Liberal coalition government, partly because the Lib Dems were too economically liberal? And didn't liberalism do pretty well in the European Parliament elections, yet the Liberals failed to get any power in the EP? So this is about the kind of, Liberals in a sense are the cause of inequality and polarisation, and actually they're a victim of it as well. So,
yeah, I mean, I think you can go way back before the coalition government. And I think you start with this story, you start with stagflation. So you start really in the late 70s, see the rise of Reagan, the rise of Thatcher, and most importantly, the guy that really joins these guys together is Milton Friedman, working from Hayek himself. And that was a result of the fact that Keynesians, who had provided from 1945 until the late 70s, the most significant expansion, I would suggest, in human liberty and in material wealth for humanity, including poorer parts of the world and richer parts of the world, than we'd ever seen in the history of our species, had a real problem when they were seeing a decline in economic growth at the same time as a rise in inflation. Stagflation was a shattering effect on the Keynesian economic model, which is really the functioning economic model that radical liberalism used. And something shifted then. Liberalism became enamored, completely seduced by laissez-faire. We saw that you could still see the after effects of that in the Lib Dem debates during coalition, with the orange bookers versus everyone else, where really they'd signed up completely. But of course, even in the Labour Party, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were quite good. They were very good, actually, to give them their due credit, at redistributing funds around the back door, tidied away. But they fully accepted the laissez-faire argument that the state should not interfere with the market will perform best if it's left to itself. So ultimately
he was intensely comfortable with David Beckham earning millions or something, as long as he paid his taxes.
Yes. And he looked very comfortable about it, to be fair to him. I didn't think he was lying. And so look, that is, one of the core things of the book is this is an error that we have made, that this is not only is laissez-faire, I don't think, a very sophisticated way of looking at individual freedom for what it really entails in the world, but that every time we set it loose, and I think you can say the same thing about, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, as you can really about the financial crash of 2008. Every time we set laissez-faire loose, it fails on its own terms because it creates such an unstable economy that we see rise to political forces, like fascism, communism back then, and as we see nationalism right now, which are a threat to liberalism.
Let me push you a little bit more on this, which is on this economic issue, which is, inequality of outcomes. We've got some equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes, right? So liberals traditionally have said, what we aim for is, what we want is equality of opportunity. Equality of outcomes, that can just happen on its own. But we need to have a certain sense of equality of outcomes because it affects the next generation of opportunities, right? So what we do is provide some sort of safety net, right? So beyond that safety net, do we care about equality above that safety net? Is it okay for people just to be super rich, or as long as we have that safety net which provides new opportunities for the next generation, as long as we have that minimum, where people, of course, as a liberal, we care about real choice or that, opportunities, genuine opportunities that are economic opportunities and social opportunities. You don't have that freedom unless you have a certain level of economic wealth individually or in a household. So you need that certain level to be able to exercise those freedoms. Without that level, you don't have those freedoms. But beyond that, do we care necessarily about inequality?
So I personally am not too bothered about that relative level. And I would also suggest actually lots of moderate socialists feel the same way, that they'll talk about levels of 1 to 50, for instance, to dictate the rough number of sort of level of inequality you would see. But also, I wouldn't underestimate just how radical you have to be in order to ensure equality of opportunity. I mean, when John Stuart Mill talked about this stuff, he was talking about nationalising all the land, so all you could have would be a small garden and a house. There'd be no rights to have any more than that. The way he talked constantly about landlords and their money falling into their mouth as they slept was all about the fact that you have to earn the money that you have. I thought he would be very critical of the kind of asset inequality that we have in our current society. I think, to be honest, if you're talking about equality of opportunity, I can't see a really consistent argument which would allow private schools to exist. If they don't work, they're fraudulent, and if they do work, they'd be morally intolerable under that circumstance. So ultimately, it is the opportunity that matters more, but I just don't think we should underestimate just the radical kind of policies you would end up pursuing if you really commit to that premise.
That's actually quite similar to Tony Atkinson's view of inequality. His book on inequality is really, his justification for why we should care about inequality of outcomes is very similar to that sort of argument. Anyway.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't read that.
Next question, Tanya Jane Park. Question for Ian. Where does he stand on cancel culture? And I mean by that, not the social media pylons, but often associated with the term, but with the right or not of businesses, organizations to fire or drop people because of their actions or statements. The idea that individuals have freedom of speech, you have to accept that freedom of speech isn't without consequences.
That's entirely correct. And any business can decide who it is or is not going to publish. And that seems to me just a basic fact that we don't need to go over. However, we also do need to be careful about a quite lazy riposte that flies up whenever this comes up, which is to say, it's not censorship, and censorship in this case is very narrowly defined to basically the state coming in, taking away your laptop, whereas in fact, people can be silenced in a variety of ways. Now, there are several journalists out there, for instance, and actors as well, public figures of all sorts, who are essentially presented with a situation where they are stopped from contributing work anywhere they go, where any magazine they approach, any radio station they go on, there is a concerted campaign saying you can't have them because they are immoral for the following reasons. Now,
David Starkey.
Well, actually, Starkey is probably one of them now, although I thought back when he made his comments sort of 8 years ago about race, I thought that he would be one of them then. So the fact that he's still around and part of the discussion, I wouldn't necessarily underestimate his ability to continue. Now, it therefore seems to me that that person is being silenced. Now, you can come up with an argument for some of this stuff. Remember, like, when you look at the free speech principles that Princess Harriet Taylor would put forward, it wasn't about you cannot condemn. It wasn't that you cannot criticize. It was to say that basically what you can't do is take away the freedom to do a thing. Now, of course, you can condemn someone if you think that they're a racist. But I do think at the moment we have a trend towards constantly trying to shut down people's avenues for expressing themselves and then hanging back and going, it's not censorship because it wasn't the state. You think, well, you are trying to shut down their ability to speak rather than challenging the arguments that they put forward. And as a final point on this, I would use that, by the way, for social media itself. People, especially women, face so much abuse on social media, often very targeted abuse, that it's occasionally impossible as a normal functioning emotional person to use social media. You just simply would not do it. No one wants to switch it on. Anyone that's had a pile-on of any amount will know that if you were to switch on your phone every day and just see page after page of being told the most awful things about yourself, you're not going to use it anymore. And I view that as well as a kind of silencing. So it's true that just being private companies decide who they want on their platforms. Of course, you can do that. But I think we also need a more nuanced idea of what it is to be silenced by someone. And it is not just the state coming in and stopping them legally from talking.
So on social media, I want to push a bit more on this because I find this interesting. Every time we've had new information or communication technologies, people have wrung their hands and say, this is the end of democracy, it's the end of liberalism.
Yeah.
When we had the radio invented, we were never going to have democracy. And when we had the liberalization of TV, everyone said, we're going to brainwash the public because we've got 100,000 TV stations and we used to only have 4, and now everyone's just going to be zombies in front of the TV. And so isn't social media just the latest new form of and so we haven't yet figured out how we work at it as humans, as individuals, haven't we yet? It'll take a while before we work out, which, for example, with the complete liberalization of TV, everyone thought it was going to just be a dumbing down of TV content, and then actually some quality emerged, some little pockets of quality, and people then focused on those quality and let the dross disappear, right? So is that similar? Can you see a similar sort of development potentially in the social media space?
I really hope that's true. And I instinctively want to agree with your argument because it's exactly the kind of thing I end up saying all the time of like, back off video games, back off this. It's just people having fun. There are qualitative differences. One of them is that the advertising structure in social media is completely imbued into the product itself. Now, until now, we came across adverts, you walk by a billboard, it comes on the TV, but you know the adverts have started, there's 2 minutes of them, then it starts again. Unless, of course, you're watching American TV, in which case it's like half an hour of adverts and 2 minutes of programming. But here, this is what you get. Now, the approach on social media was not really to provide a service, it was engagement, because these are advertising companies. This is how they make their money, through advertising. So they need your engagement. And to get your engagement, they use techniques that have been very common in advertising for a long time, which we haven't previously seen in the thing we are approaching in its own right. What they've found is that the two aspects that seem to get our attention the most are really tribalism and emotion. That by delivering for an identity group, you tend to increase engagement. By promising emotion, which is why you see things like, what happened next will shock you, and you won't believe what she looks like now, and blah, blah, blah. On the more, generous end of things. On the further end is the constant Twitter thing of this will make you sick, this will make you want to burn the world down, which is really all that Twitter is on a daily basis at this stage. Now that is qualitatively different. And if you look at our behavior towards this kind of media, it is qualitatively different. It is doing things to us that weren't happening by TV. I do accept that similar arguments would have been heard when the printing press turned out, or rather 100 years after the printing press, when they started producing pamphlets on it that could be read and heard in pubs by the common man. And yet, I think that that's quite an instructive instance, because that technology really did change the world. And looking at what social media is doing to us now, you get the very firm impression that if this is what it's doing in the opening stages, it really could go on to change things quite fundamentally.
Okay, so let's have another one. Daniel Block, your book demonstrates a long history of liberalism where we can see recent events repeat history in the sense that views on liberalism now are not unique to the present. With this in mind, how do you see liberalism developing in relation to expected changes in society, as discussed in books like Paul Mason's Post-Capitalism, with technology potentially radically altering our approach to work and leisure? Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, it shouldn't surprise me. I knew I was doing LSE, so I should have known they were going to be very posh, very well-educated questions. So I'm very glad to get them.
I think it's posh. I think it's articulate.
No, exactly. I didn't mean posh as a bad thing. I quite like posh. To me, the technology will have an impact on the manner in which we approach life, as we've just talked about with social media. But the fundamental principles that we use still shine a light on the changes in liberalism. I don't see anything that challenges the fundamental truth of the freedom of the individual as the operating mechanism of politics. What I see is that we change and we become more sophisticated in our appreciation of it. And one of the big changes, right, came with, for instance, the franchise. When the franchise was fully expanded, when you had free education, you suddenly got whole classes of people, women, ethnic minorities, who've been completely frozen out of the liberal story, suddenly in a position to start making their claim on liberal principles. And what did they bring? They brought a completely different appreciation for individual freedom. So whereas, in the 1800s, you'd ask inevitably wealthy white man about what individual freedom was. He says, free speech, the right to vote, sometimes the right to vote, and the right to property, and on we go. Suddenly people were saying, well, what about office harassment? How come office harassment isn't part of my individual freedom? And how am I supposed to have a proper career if I have to put up with this stuff? What about racial discrimination? And that's a much broader sense of freedom to community. Sorry? Exactly. Or when people start talking in a way that seems to me incredibly positive at the moment about the manner in which we think of our gender and our sexuality, that maybe the idea of heterosexual and homosexual don't have to be these great monolithic blocks, that actually we can be on these sort of spectrums of different kinds of identity. Now that is chiseling away at a kind of restriction of freedom that has operated since time immemorial. Like how many lives were sort of suffocated and less than they could have been because of this idea of these monolithic blocks of sexuality. And now, quite excitingly, we're seeing people start to challenge those ideas, trying to come up with new language for how we can think about this kind of freedom, of individual freedom. So it seems to me that those changes will keep on happening. They will be incomprehensible to the guys in the Victorian period who came up with this stuff. But that's the beauty of the concept. That's the beauty of the moral ideal of it, that it is able to just shift through periods, constantly shining a light and providing new avenues for self-creation and for the liberation of the individual.
Great. It leads on a little bit to the next question. Michael Ward, does equality of opportunity have a future in a world of identity politics? Can the two really coexist, or does liberalism now implicitly favour equality of outcome as a result of this? So generally, what's your view of identity politics? I mean, you address.
Oh, I know that I can answer much easier. I was trying to clock the outcome.
Identity. So articulate your view of identity politics, and then talk about how you reconcile, or the relationship between your view of identity politics and your perception of equality of opportunity.
So identity politics and the campaigns around it brought a lot of very useful things to liberalism. I mean, one of the big questions that they asked, in fact, you could go way back before the beginning of, I'm putting the beginning of identity politics really with the Combahee River Collective, sort of in the late 70s. But if you go back even earlier on feminist thought, once they started asking questions around standpoint theory basically being that your appreciation of the world, your ability to process the knowledge of it, the information of it, is at least in some part, and that caveat's very important, affected by who you are within that world. And that led to the kind of thinking I was mentioning just now of, okay, well, maybe freedom of individualism means office harassment and things like that, not just freedom of speech, for instance. So it provided some very useful things, and it potentially, if liberals had been open enough to it, and they weren't, would lead them to ask more searching questions of a wider range of people to come up with a full appreciation of human liberty. However, there is also a danger in identity politics, and that's that it doesn't necessarily correspond to the way that we talk about identity in liberal theory. Now, in liberal theory, when we say identity, I'm following on here from Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin would have absolutely hated what I'm about to say because he thought about it in terms of the nation rather than nationalized groups, but frankly, he was wrong to do that. There's nothing in his theory that can't be applied elsewhere. We think of it as the individual picking an identity. I say I feel British. You say you feel English. You associate this with the specials and madness, which I had never thought of as English. But, but then it's part. We compose these parts of an identity that we find meaning in, and that we can find political meaning in. Something inciting us in our political activity. For Orwell, it was the cup of tea and the football match in the back garden, were all expressions of a sort of innate privacy in the English psychology that prevented this kind of monolithic, all-powerful state from being able to interfere in our freedom. In some parts of identity politics circles, there's a different view of identity, which is that it's firstly homogenous, so that each person is the same as everyone else within that identity group. And secondly, that identity groups are fundamentally distinct from other groups, so that you would never be able to have the sharing of information, the sharing of cultural artifacts between these groups. Now, that pathway leads fundamentally towards cultural relativism, really, moral relativism. It's a dangerous, dangerous place. And and I think that when you see some of the more outer reaches of it, when you look at cultural appropriation, which is literally this idea as if sort of songs or food was something that exists within a different territory, and you need to check with the gatekeepers before you can get in. Now, very quickly, problems emerge. You ask, who are these gatekeepers? What is their mandate? On what basis do they claim to represent the group?
Can you tell the audience the story, because who haven't read the book, the bit in the book about the American artist who was cancelled, who produced the art of was it the black child who had been murdered, and she painted a picture of it?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a New York art exhibition where there happened to be two paintings of murdered black people, and one was painted by a white artist. Of course, in both of these cases, the paintings were anti-racist paintings, in order to continue a movement. And in one case, the painting was by a white artist, and in the other case, the painting was by a black artist. And the white artist was told that you do not have the right to enter into the subject matter, you don't have the right to depict it. But again, this goes quite far back, and in fact, it actually becomes very modern. I mean, even this week, there was a Twitter thread from someone complaining that a white-owned shop was selling white-owned restaurant was selling Asian food, and it got so far that a business that shared the premises said it was no longer prepared to be there with them. Now, that view seems to me to be quite catastrophic, and most catastrophic for those who are pushed into being part of that group. Now, oddly enough, we have seen versions of this in English political history for some time now. After the Brixton riots, really in the 70s, 80s, we saw quite commonly an approach by local government to find community leaders who would represent a community, be representing the Chinese community or the Muslim community or whatever. Now, those leaders had no mandate. They had no basis to claim to represent the community. And yet they were able to operate as a transmission agent between the funding of local government and the people that lived around them. They were typically reaction, and far from being a left-wing outcome, they were typically reactionary, religious, older men, connected very often to the local church, to local businesses. Now, in that case, what happens to the young lesbian teenager in that circumstance? How is she represented by someone who doesn't even believe that she exists, who wipes her from the face of the earth? So whenever we lose the individual in the politics of identity, we present ourselves with these very, very dangerous moments where people claim to represent a homogenous mass. And yet, nevertheless, liberalism has things to learn from identity and must recognize identity because people express it. And what I hope for the next few years is that we see more of an approach of a sympathy with what is trying to be done, a sympathy with what needs to change in our society, but also a critical eye to what this stuff represents. Because very often what we get is the sort of Douglas Murray, it's all rubbish, they're all woke, blah, blah, blah stuff, and the passionate, frenzied, sometimes silencing effects of those who support it. Whereas in fact, we do, sorry to sound like such a boring liberal, but we do need something in the middle of those two positions in order for us to progress sensibly.
Excellent. I'm going to pick two questions that are related to each other. I'm conscious of time and I'm not going to be able to answer all of these or allow all of them to ask all of these. But the first one is from Emma Levi. Does the harm principle apply to freedom of speech? Could it limit the right of cartoonists to mock the Prophet Muhammad? And then I'm going to ask the Mike Salem question, which is kind of related. Mike Salem, LSE student, second year. How do you foresee the development of liberalism in the Middle East? Is it something that Arabs would be keen on adopting as an ideology? Mm-hmm. So I think interrelated questions. I'm trying to pick a few questions to get them together.
So, I mean, look, the hump, it's a really interesting question on the harm principle and depicting Muhammad. So, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor say something very clear. They say, yes, there are limitations on freedom of speech. If you have a crowd, if you have a mob of people at a protest on grain prices, and they're right outside of the house of the guy that sells the grain, you are entitled to stop this. Basically, if it looks like they're going to kill him, it's really their criteria. But notice the tests for it. It's not just that there's incitement to violence in a normal context. It's that in that specific circumstance, there's a realistic prospect of incitement for violence. I remember thinking about this when Katie Hopkins wrote that piece about gunboating refugee boats, gunboating, about firing shotguns into refugee boats, where the question wasn't what has she said, because that seemed like an open and shut case. The question to me is, what is the context? Is it likely that violence will follow from this? Now, what's weird about the Muhammad example is actually that's sort of flipped, because our danger there is that you're not dealing with violence towards the person who's experiencing it. In this case, what we've seen is violence towards the people that are showing the cartoon. And I have to say, look, you can come up with a moral judgment on the people who do this stuff. And if I was in a magazine, editing a magazine, there's no way I would publish any of these cartoons, because you'd just be like, why would you be needlessly doing it? But when it comes to the right to publish this stuff, I'm sorry, but under any criteria of free speech, there is the right to publish this stuff. And the fact that people are hurt or offended does not allow you to interfere in that process on a legal basis. Your editorial judgment may be different, but we do have to stand up to the fact that people can publish what they want. Now, I got so into answering that question that I completely forgot what the second one is.
The other one was about liberalism in the Middle East and in the Arab world. Do you see potential for it? I mean, the Arab Spring, of course, was a birth of it, partial successful in Tunisia, but not really successful anywhere else.
So I do quite a lot of work with refugees here, a lot of which would, have left typically from countries that went through the Arab Spring, from countries especially like Egypt. And these guys are committed to basic liberal values over and over. I mean, the fact that I'm meeting them as refugees here gives you an indication of how things are going over there. But the commitment is there. And the commitment, by the way, is also shared by many people who are intensely religious, who are strongly committed to their Muslim faith, and are still strongly committed to freedom of speech, including in the kind of examples that we're talking about here. So I do see it there. However, all of that is anecdotal to my experience, and I'm obviously much more likely to meet the kind of person from that country who speaks in this way. So I cannot come up with any kind of degree of expertise in how things are going to go there. But I do, from my personal connection, see a tremendous reason for hope in many of the countries that we're talking about.
Great. So Kevin Holder has asked a series of questions. Some of them on Scotland, I think we've already answered, but there's one he's asked that says, has liberalism's reputation been diminished by social progressives operating under the banner of liberalism who are not always liberal in their approach, the so-called illiberal liberals?
I don't know who that means. I mean, there's many people in this world who I wish would stop calling themselves liberals, because I just do not accept that they remotely are liberal. And the basis of it, I would much rather they signed up to the values, but I wish they'd stop using the word. And I see that on left and right. I actually see it much more on the right than I do on the left, typically. But I don't know specifically who the question refers to, so it's hard for me to answer.
Let me put it all the way around. Can we force people to be free? So for example, what's your view of, the headscarves in France? So my son now studies in France, and I think he's completely changed his views on this issue since he's been studying in France. So when he was in the UK, he was very much of the view that, of course, freedom of the individual. If women want to wear headscarves, who are we to interfere? And the discourse is very different in France about this, from also a liberal perspective, rather than it being a socialist perspective. There's a limit to which they say, we are going to make you free. So, I mean, what's your view of that sort of stuff?
It's interesting that you asked me this, because I know that you've worked with Brian Barry, for instance, who's one of the leading people who's informed my own ideas about this many years down the line. So, yeah. These are really tough questions for liberals, and there are no satisfying answers to them. And anyone that does come up to you with a one-stage answer on this stuff, it shows that they're not thinking about it clearly. Now, if you take the hijabs, for instance, I mean, it doesn't have to be. They could do the same thing about the Catholic Church. You could do it about any number of areas. The hijab is
marriages. And so
exactly, yeah. The hijab is a very it crops up, I think, because it's one of the ones people can see on the street the most often. It seems to me that even a ban on public buildings, rather than banning anywhere else, seems to me an infringement on people's personal liberty to wear it. However, when we say that someone has autonomy, that they make free choices to adopt this, for instance, an item of religious clothing, we have to be sure that they have used autonomy to adopt that. So that involves quite a lot of interference by the state in the early part of life. And I think key to that is education of what happens in school, that we raise people to make their own judgments, to decide if you want to live a very traditional conservative role in your community, you do it, but that is your choice to make. You cannot be bullied into it by typically older men, but often with the connivance of older women within conservative religious communities. We will also say that there are plenty of elements where at that young stage, up to 18, the state can interfere, as we do, for instance, in female genital mutilation. I mean, we already accept this principle when it comes to certain aspects, and we don't with others. So this is a tough area for liberalism. The literature on it, I find completely fascinating. And if that is widely available, you look at sort of people like Kimlicka, people like Barry, some of the feminist liberal criticism of this stuff is probably where the most vigorous, exciting critique of it comes. And it is tough, treacherous water as you work your way through it. But it's only by doing that that you escape the brute, simplistic answers that I think come from ban it or allow everything, which simply just doesn't work. I've done it again. I did exactly the liberal thing again, and I've just ended up doing what's somewhere in the middle is the honest answer to your question.
No, but I think you make the point that these sorts of policy questions don't have simple answers.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually a liberal position. If you think there's a simple answer to this, you are wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
We should be skeptical about our own knowledge, and we need to be skeptical about our own understanding of a lot of issues that are not issues that we are involved in every day. And because of that skepticism, I think we need to have a sort of healthy view of we cannot always be right about everything. And often policy is sort of trial and error, and we need to be prepared that things don't work, and we should have evidence-based policy and not policy-based evidence. And this, so I think it's very healthy in this world when I think we live in a world now where you've got a kind of politicians on one side saying, I know all the answers and they're this, and on the other side, no, you're completely wrong. I know all the answers and these are those.
Mm. And you actually see that again throughout the liberal story of just the acknowledgement of complexity is key to it all the way through. And again, I think it flows from the unit of the individual, that just by doing that, you're already instantly in a game of trade-offs, of balancing goods, of balancing rights, of balancing liberties. And as soon as you go there, the whole world of complexity opens up to you. The moment that you turn away from it, that you start pretending there are simple answers towards things, is usually a time that you're going a path, not just away from liberalism, but very quickly towards dictating what other people get to do with their lives.
The way that I think of it is you accept the heterogeneity of mankind, the heterogeneity of the individual. We all have heterogeneous experiences, heterogeneous preferences. So one size fits all types of public policies often neglect that heterogeneity and cause problems for the autonomy of individuals and different types of autonomy. So I think there's so I like your idea that part of the complexity is also related to the fact that the individuals themselves are heterogeneous.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I love the question by Daniel Coyne. Can Ian make a case for Brexit? P.S. I'm a Remainer.
on a liberal basis?
A liberal case for Brexit.
Yeah, well, I mean, you would have to do it.
Ask the same question. Is there a liberal Brexit? Or was there ever a liberal Brexit?
It's not, you know what, it's not impossible as long as you're willing to deal with the objective world. And in fact, what's been fascinating to me is how many of the liberal Brexiters I knew at the beginning went to Remain. And the others, for instance, like there are someone like Daniel Hannan, just kind of gave up on arguing for the project and went with the waves of it. You can make the case on separation of powers. You would say too much power went to the continental level rather than domestic one. This was no longer really a separation of power, but actually became a threat towards the democratic process at home. We are going to wish to leave. We're going to put that principle above the economic damage that we accept is going to happen. And you would not fly off into this realm of post-truth fantasy on border controls and pretending that distance doesn't matter with trade. You would deal with reality, but say, we're prioritizing this because we think the political dangers are severe enough. That would be, in my case, in my view, an error of judgment of assessing the relative danger of a situation, but it would not be the kind of moral error that we've seen, I think, from Brexiters. So you could do it. It wouldn't be a very strong case, but you could still have a consistent case for it. What's striking to me is I haven't seen anyone make it. And the guys that were making that case pretty much all came over to Remain sort of 2017, 2018, when it just, the nonsense.
What frustrated me was very few politicians in the House of Commons. Look, I was a Remainer and an avid Remainer, I've always been a Remainer, but after we voted to leave, I tried to make that kind of liberal Brexit case. Okay, let's accept that as nations, we've got heterogeneous preferences about the process of European integration, and it's not quite for us. But that's fine. But as liberals with a kind of liberal nationalist interpretation, you know, there's a lot of this we would still sign up to. We'd still sign up to the single market, some, you know, regulatory. We still want to preserve the individual liberty elements of the European project, which was actually potentially the pinnacle of human liberty in our little corner of the world. You know, freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and labour is a phenomenal liberal achievement when you think broad historical global terms. And wouldn't we want to try and preserve as much of that as we possibly could? And so that would mean a sort of EFTA or EEA type solution, at least initially, while we try and figure out what the governance architecture of that is, while we, you know, work through it. And what frustrated me is I couldn't get anybody in the Lib Dems or in Labour to be interested in that. So Labour would say, oh, no, we have to limit the free movement of people. We couldn't possibly, it's all about immigration. But then the Lib Dems were like, remain, deny this has ever happened. And nobody was willing to stand up and say, we can have a Brexit, but a different sort of Brexit. A Brexit that actually would be supported by the median voter in this, who was probably a liberal leaver. The median vote of 52-48 was probably a liberal leaver. And so that would have been, but, you know, probably too late now. But anyway.
You never know. I mean, to be honest, in the next...
we need to wrap up, sorry, but let you say the last words over to you. But
in the next 10 to 15 years, it's not impossible that kind of EFTA EEA approach could actually provide the most attractive political avenue of going with what will anyway be the remorseless impact of trade reality on the direction of where England is in the world. So you might be too late with those ideas, or you might just be too early.
I actually think there's an opportunity now for the debate in the UK. It's going to become a kind of Boris-type Brexit versus a more liberal version of Brexit that potentially would be a softer version of Brexit. I think that's optimistically where I hope the debate goes anyway. Well, Ian, thank you so much. This has been really fantastic. Go and buy the book. It's fantastic. It's so great. I'm going to buy it for my kids for Christmas.
Poor kids, man. Poor kids.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for the questions, everybody. Look out for the podcast. Hope you have a good break over the holiday season. Bye.